Seth drove exactly at the speed limit the whole way to the printer, coming to a complete stop at every stop sign. He held the steering wheel with both hands and checked his mirrors 5 times a minute. We handed over our paperwork in the storefront office and sat down to wait on the mahogany-red vinyl sofa. Seth draped his arm along the back, a little too close to me, but not quite close enough that I could shrug it off. I stood up and wandered around the room to look at the framed handbills hanging on the walls, samples of the printer's work. After a few minutes, we heard the thumping trundle of our order approaching on a dolly. "Here you go, kids," said the printer. "There's your disc back and your receipt." Seth insisted on opening a box and inspecting a copy of the magazine. He flipped through it, snapping the pages to feel the weight of the paper, and studied the cover picture through a magnifying frame he found on a counter. I couldn't help rolling my eyes. The printer winked at me. "Everything look okay?" he asked Seth. Seth completed his inspection. "It's all good," he pronounced. We rolled the boxes out to the car, Seth pulling, me steadying, the dolly doing its best to make a break for it, and loaded them into the trunk. They were heavier than they looked. "Bend from the knees," instructed Seth. "Use your legs, not your back." On the way back to school, I made up my mind to find out whether Seth was responsible for the sonnet on the tree. I hoped not, but if so, perhaps there was more to him than I thought. "Seth, have you ever written a sonnet?" I asked. "Oh, yes, several. I had one in the issue before last of Sailing, don't you remember? My most recent was for Ms. Nettleton's class, for the creative writing assignment in October. It was about moral responsibility. Why do you ask? Are you writing one? Would you like me to read it and give you advice? It's a tricky form, but I'm sure you can learn." Seth, I concluded with a silent sigh of relief, could not be our secret arboreal author. Last week's sonnet, with its references to snow, must have been written more recently than October, and if Seth had written it, he would have made sure I knew. After we unloaded the boxes in the English department office, Seth had Ms. Nettleton's elevator key, a sign of supreme favor. He asked, "Want to stop at the Java jail? It's only 4:30, so we have plenty of time before your dad expects us. Come on, let's get a mocharetto. This is cause for celebration." "All right," I said reluctantly. "Just one." The Java jail was crowded when we got there. I grabbed the only table left, a tippy, drafty one near the door, while Seth went to order. Looking around, I saw with alarm that most of the customers were boys in four-field uniforms. What if someone I knew saw me with Seth? He came back with our steaming drinks. "Here you go." He moved his chair closer to mine and lifted his paper cup in its dimpled cardboard sleeve. "A toast to Sailing, the magazine that brought us together." As I lifted my cup in return, I felt a cold blast run down my neck. Foreboding? Air from outside? It seemed rude not to return the toast, but I couldn't quite bear to meet Seth's eyes, so I turned mine away, and met, instead, the eyes of Grandison Parr standing at the door. "Hello, Julia," said Parr with a formal smile. "Parr? I thought you guys had finals." "They ended today. We get the afternoon to blow off steam." Seth cleared his throat. "Oh, I'm sorry," I said. "Seth Young, Grandison Parr. Seth and I, we work on the literary magazine. He's in my English class. I trailed off. "How do you do?" said Seth stiffly, offering his hand as if he expected a Forefield boy to have fancy manners and wanted to prove that his were just as good. Parr took his hand and shook it. "A pleasure. Well, don't let me interrupt." He gave me another formal smile and moved on into the cafe. Should I have asked him to join us? But I wouldn't have been able to bear it, having Parr see Seth at his most pompous, having Parr think that this was the sort of person I would choose to associate with. My mocharetto scorched my mouth. I edged my chair around so that I had my back to Parr. For the duration of our drinks, I felt my back burning like a sacked and fallen city. Naturally, my father was pulling into the garage just as Seth and I drove up. He stopped at the door and watched Seth perform a perfect, though unnecessary, parallel parking maneuver. "Come on in," he said. "Seth, I presume? You're staying to dinner, right?" "Oh, yes, thanks," said Seth, stepping out of the car and following Dad into the house. "Amy, this is Julie's friend Seth," said my father. "Nice to meet you, Mrs. Lefkowitz," said Seth. "Hello, Seth. I'm glad you can stay," said the irresistible. "There's plenty of food. I roasted a leg of lamb." She turned to me. "And I made that mint sauce you like, sweetie, with fresh mint from the Lou's greenhouse." The thought of the Lou's greenhouse, on top of everything else, made my stomach lurch. While I struggled to eat dinner, Seth regaled Dad and Amy with details of our sailing responsibilities and my improvement in Miss Nettleton's eyes since I'd taken them on. I watched my father and stepmother inflating with approval, like Aunt Ruth's air mattress. I wondered how soon, also like the air mattress, it would all leak out again. "Seth," I said when dinner was over, "don't you have to get going? Doesn't the limited junior license come with a curfew?" "Yes, you're right. 9 p.m., said Seth reluctantly. "Thanks for dinner, Mrs. Lefkowitz. It was delicious. Julie, walk me to the car?" Dinner with my folks had clearly boosted his confidence. He looked as though he might try to kiss me once my father and Amy were out of sight. "No shoes," I said, wiggling my toes in his direction. I stayed firmly seated and let Amy show him out. "Thanks again, Mrs. Lefkowitz. See you tomorrow, Julie." "What a nice young man! Good-looking, too," said Amy after the door shut. "You sly girl, is that why you joined the literary magazine? Why didn't you tell us?"